Hey, hello everyone. So welcome to join our um, science webinars. So my name is Yuchao Liang. I'm a postdoc at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University in USA. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Fyfe. So John is a senior research scientist at Canadian Center for Climate Modeling and Analysis, CCCMA. And John's research is focusing on climate variability and climate change using observations and the large ensemble global climate model simulations. And he's one of the leading authors of the IPCC assessment report. Today, John's going to talk about his recent work on the influence of short-term emission reductions on climate. So before we start webinars, I want to briefly go through the code of conduct. So John, can you go to next? Yeah. So first of all, please be polite and respectful to the speaker and all the participants. And please type your questions in the chat box first. I think anytime you can post your questions, and the speaker will reply to your questions during Q&A, and I will read through your questions. And finally, just be aware that we are recording all the contents in the presentation and the message in the chat box. Okay, so thank you, John, for being with us today, and time is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess full disclosure, if you haven't figured out yet, I'm not a young Earth system scientist. I'm an old Earth system scientist. So, but it sure is a pleasure to meet with all of you. And yes, I'm going to talk about the influence of short-term emission reductions on climate. Now, the context here, of course, is the current pandemic that we're living in. But the scope of my presentation is going to be broader than that. I'm going to be looking at emission reductions that are less than what we've observed so far as part of this pandemic, emission reductions that are about the same, and emission reductions that are much larger. After all, this particular pandemic hasn't played itself out. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few months or year. We also don't know what we're going to face in terms of future pandemics. God forbid we have them. And so we thought it'd be useful to look at the problem more broadly than just this particular pandemic. Okay, so that's the scope of the presentation. And the way I like to look at this particular problem or present it is look at it in terms of the sequence of cause and effect, from changes in emissions to concentration in the atmosphere to response. And the analogy that I'm using here is a tap. So if you think about carbon dioxide, we know, of course, that the tap is full on, and anthropogenic carbon dioxide is flowing into the system. We know that because of that, the concentration of CO2 is building up in the atmosphere. And we see that in observations, and we know using observations and models and doing attribution studies that is generating a response in the climate system, most notably rising temperatures. So this is not new news to any of you. The issue here has to do with the interesting situation or question: what would happen if if the tap was turned down a little bit, or maybe even a lot, for a short period of time, and then turned back up again over the course of a year or two, like we've seen with the current pandemic? How would that disrupt this sequence of cause and effect? And this is something that scientists really haven't thought about before very much. You might find instances somewhere hidden in the literature, but it isn't a well-studied problem. And it gives us an opportunity now to look at this situation and understand get a better understanding of the climate system. Now, to make this particular problem even more complicated than this, not only are the emissions of CO2 declining, but the emissions of many other greenhouse gases are declining, and the emissions of non-greenhouse gases, aerosols and so on, are also declining. And each one of these has its impact through the climate system, and either warms the atmosphere, has a warming influence, or a cooling influence. And so it's really the combination of all of these influences that we're trying to quantify and identify here. So it's both a new and an important problem and a complicated problem at that. Okay, so that's all by way of introduction. My presentation is going to be in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to present something borrowed. Okay, this isn't my work, it's the work of others. And it's this paper excellent paper by Forster et al. That appeared a few months ago in Nature Climate Change, entitled Current and Future Global Climate Impacts Resulting from COVID-19. And what they did is assemble all the available emissions observations up to the end of June. And they looked at those emissions in terms, and dissected them and looked at them in terms of, how they looked across sectors, how they looked across species, and how they looked regionally, US, China, and so on. So that was a beautiful piece of analysis. And then they amalgamated all this information and put it into a very simple climate model in order to infer what might happen to globally average temperature during COVID and going into the future. And this is a very simple model. It's basically just a big slab of atmosphere and a big slab of ocean with a few tunable parameters. And it yielded some interesting results, and I'll show you those results in a minute, but it is highly simplified. It has in it no feedbacks, the familiar feedbacks we're used to in climate science between clouds and aerosols and so on. There's no feedbacks. It has no internal variability like you see in the atmosphere. And it only applies to global average temperature and nothing else. So that's the only information you get from a model as simple as this. And so that brings us to the second part of my presentation, which is our work, where we are looking at this problem using a complete and comprehensive Earth system model. So this is a model that has an interactive atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and a complete carbon cycle, where that includes all the feedbacks. It includes internal variability like you'd see in the atmosphere, and allows us to look at more than just global average surface temperature. We can look at anything in the atmosphere, from sea ice to precipitation to you name it. We can look at it in principle. And so that's the second part of my presentation. So that's the way it's going to play out. And I'll start with the Forster et al. Paper, and I just have kind of 4 slides here. Some of this might be familiar to you, some of it might not be, but this is where we stand as of June in terms of our understanding of emission reductions associated with COVID-19 containment. So this is a plot of fossil fuel CO2 emission changes for April, so averaged over April relative to the year before, okay? And you're looking at these changes across sectors. So if you look in the x-axis, we have surface transport, residential, public commercial, industry, and then the total. And for each one of these sectors, there are some bars that indicate that we have 2 or more estimates of the emission reductions across these different sectors. There's also a big black bar, and that gives you an uncertainty range in one of these estimates, okay? And so what we learned from this graphic is that, yes, if you look to the far right of the total, there have been significant emission reductions, and that those emission reductions are dominated by surface transport. So that is people and things not moving around as much, which would make sense, followed by changes in industry, followed by public and commercial, and then residential. In the residential sector, emissions have actually increased a little bit, although it's just on the verge of being statistically insignificant, which would make sense. People aren't out and about, rather they're sitting at home. And so that's an interesting figure. Here's another look. This is the time march from January 1st, day by day, going to the end of June. And this is the change in these various emissions in percentage terms relative to last year or the year before, depending on the species. And the species range, if you look at the top, from CO2 in blue and down to the bottom, NOx in cyan. I guess that's the color. Now, all these species, if you look at these curves, beginning in kind of mid-March, they started to decline. The emissions declined, some greater and some lesser, but they all showed this behavior. And then by mid-April, leveled out, and then have started and then recovered to June. And they have continued to recover, we know that. Let's pick out a couple of these quantities. CO2, for example. CO2 is a long-lived, very powerful greenhouse gas. And if you screw in your eyeballs and look for the blue curve here, you can see that emissions decline in CO2 to about 25%, what they were the year before. In NOx, on the other hand, which is the cyan curve, emission reductions dropped to more than 35%. So those are the kinds of numbers that have been seen in global average sense. And now this is another graphic before I get to the temperature plot that just breaks things down a little bit for us. So again, these are all these species on the left axis from carbon dioxide down to NOx. And these are the emission changes as a percent averaged over April, and then broken down into regions. So from the right to the left, you're looking at China, the USA, European Union and the UK in purple, India, international aviation, and then the rest of the world. And so just pick out a couple of these bars. So if you look at CO2, as we saw in the previous graph, the decrease in CO2 globally was about 25%. And most of that decline was attributed to the United States, followed by India. You can go down and look at a short-lived forcer, an aerosol, sulfur dioxide, for example, similar story. Emissions were down by over 20%, and those emission reductions were dominated by India. And then NOx, which is the biggie here, declined by over 30%, mainly coming from the US and India. Okay, so that's kind of just a very brief summary of our understanding of, of emission reductions. And I can tell you a lot of effort went into this. Large teams of people assembling kind of standard information as well, really interesting information from Apple mobility information. They had apps, Google mobility information, and assembled all of this information for us. And then, as I said, this information was aggregated and put into this really simple model. And this is what it tells us about global surface temperatures. So I should mention that they took the observations that ran up to June, and then they linearly extrapolated those observations into the future. So we have a time range here from 2020 to 2030, but the observational part is only in the very beginning, and then there was an extrapolation. I'll point out in the vertical axis, so this is global average surface temperature. In the vertical axis, the numbers are very small. So these changes are measured in sort of hundredths of a degree Celsius. Okay, so these are not big impacts, but they're interesting. And so things are broken down here into different species or combinations of species. We have aerosols are treated in green. We have tropospheric ozone, carbon dioxide, and then the total in blue. And so let's just look at the blue curve, okay? You can see following the blue curve from the beginning of 2020, there was actually warming in this, well, this model predicts warming up to about 0.005 degrees Celsius that carried on for several years. And then it's predicted that cooling will happen after that out to 2030 to the tune of about 1/100th of a degree Celsius. And so we have this nonlinear behavior, and that behavior can only be understood by looking at these other, the constituent emission reductions. So you can see that the warming in the first few years that we see in the blue curve is really driven by aerosol changes. Now, there were aerosol reductions. Aerosols reflect solar radiation, and hence if you have fewer aerosols, you have less reflection and a warming influence. And so aerosols will actually warm the system over this short period of time. These aerosols are relatively short-lived, and so this is a thing that doesn't last for very long. And that's the reason why the green curve, peaks and turns over and then heads off to zero. The cooling that you see further on, say out to 2030, is driven by tropospheric ozone and CO2. Now, tropospheric ozone is a byproduct of NOx. It's a short-lived species, and it's an indirect greenhouse gas. And it's indirect because it is involved in the production of tropospheric ozone, which is a greenhouse gas. And so tropospheric ozone, which is, you can see that curve there, it started with some warming that offset the aerosol, some cooling that offset the aerosol warming, and then it sort of peters out and heads off to zero in time because of the short-lived nature of NOx. The greenhouse gas effect just carries on forever. And it's really the combination of the ozone and the CO2 that has caused, in this model, cooling going out into the future. Okay, so the main message is initial warming due to aerosols and far-term cooling due to the greenhouse gases. All right. Again, very simple model. You know, can we believe it? It doesn't include all these feedbacks or internal variability. We need more information than this. And so that brings me to the second part of my presentation and our own calculations. And this is a calculation with the Canadian Earth System model, excuse me, our fifth version of this model. We've been developing in our group climate models since the late 1970s. And this is our latest model that we submitted to the IPCC. I don't know if anybody here is involved in any of the CMIP exercises. By far and away, the largest contribution from any other group in the world is from our group. We did a lot of calculations, and those are all available to you if you want to look at them. These are specialized contributions that we're also submitting to the ESGF for people to look at. The plot on the left shows you the experimental design. It actually shows you the CO2 emissions that we prescribed in our model. And there are 7 sets of experiments. So looking at the figure on the left that I'll go through, there's a baseline experiment, the thing that we compare our results to, following SSP 2-4.5. So in the IPCC world, there are a set of new emissions for the future. They're called shared socioeconomic pathways. This is one of them, and it's one that they call as being in the middle of the road. There are ones that are higher than it and lower. This is a middle of the road scenario for where society is going to go in terms of energy production and mitigation and adaptation. That's the baseline. And then you have all these colored curves on the left. These are our experiments, we're calling them blip experiments. And this is where we reduced emissions to some point over a few months and then had the emissions recover by the end of 2021. And we did, with the reductions were down to 10%, 25%, 50%, or 100%. So we have 4 sets of experiments here. The one that's more relevant to the observed situation we've seen so far is the red one, the 25% case. So we'll try to keep an eye on it. And then there are 2 other curves here labeled 1.5 and 2 degrees, just to put things in proper context. We've also done simulations where we tried to achieve the Paris targets. And this is where we adjusted the emission reductions so that we eventually stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So 7 sets of experiments. For each one of these experiments, we did 90 simulations. So these are very large ensembles of simulations. The simulations differ only in the initial conditions. So we fiddle with the initial condition a little bit, and that allows for in each one of these experiments, a different sequence of internal variability to develop. And so we have a range of plausible evolutions of internal variability with which to contend with. Big computational exercise. And okay, so now we can look at some of the results. But before, so I should say first, I'm not 100% sure about this audience. So I just want to be as clear as possible so I don't lose people. We're looking at things in a very simple way, but it's worthwhile, describing what we're doing. So as I mentioned, we have a 90-member set of baseline experiments, and we have a 90-member ensemble of perturbed experiments. And that yield 9 differences. So we just take the difference between these quantities to produce anomalies, what we call anomalies. And statistically, what we do when we're looking for a signal is we consider the ensemble mean anomaly. That is the average anomaly over the 90 members that we have. And we compute its 90% confidence interval. Now, the confidence interval allows us to judge whether or not that ensemble mean anomaly is significant or not. I mean, it's one thing to have an anomaly, but we have to demonstrate that it's robust. And that's how we do that here, very simply. And we also carry along the 90% confidence interval across the anomalies. So this is the confidence interval in the 3rd bullet multiplied by the square root of n, or about 10. And this allows us to judge if we can or not detect a signal in any individual realization, any one of these simulations, and also presumably observations. So this is what really matters to society. It's one thing to have a signal that you can't see. It's another thing to have a signal that you can detect, that you can attribute. Okay, so those are the 2 statistical features of this analysis. And now we can look at some results. So we're going to look at first at surface CO2 concentration. This is a model that is emission driven. So it has a complete carbon cycle. You put carbon, for example, into the system, and it moves around. The atmosphere gets transported, moves. scavenged, goes into the ocean, gets subducted, comes back up. It's complete carbon cycle. And with that, we have a prognostic CO2 concentration here plotted at the surface. And these are these anomalies. And again, the same color coding. We had the 4 blip experiments and the stabilization experiments. The gray shading is the 90% confidence interval on these ensemble means, as I described. And the dashed line indicates where such a signal would be detectable in any individual simulation, or presumably also in observation. So this is the detection threshold. And so what we find is that in all these experiments, we see a reduction in CO2 concentration, even in the lowest emission case, the 10% case. This just refers to the ensemble mean reduction. We also have the result that if you wanted to detect this signal, you would have to have an emission reduction case of equal to or greater than 50%. Okay, if you really wanted to see this in observations, you would need to have something twice as large, emission reduction twice as large as what we've actually observed. And so it's highly unlikely that we're going to see this in any sort of observations, but of course people are hunting for it. Plots come by me every day and people are claiming that we see something in CO2. I just pulled this off of the internet. This is monthly mean CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory from 2015 to, well, the end of this month, this month. And you're looking in the red curve at the actual values. Of course, we see this increase. And in the black curve is where the seasonal cycle has been removed. And I don't, you'd be hard pressed to see a decrease in CO2 in the last 7 or 8 months. It just isn't detectable because there's too much noise in the system if the signal is there at all. All right. So that's the first result. And now I'm going to talk about global surface air temperature in this model, a quantity that people are interested in. And in the same format, we're looking at anomalies from 2020 to 2030 for these 4 blip experiments. And the shading again is the 5 to 95% confidence interval on the ensemble mean. And just remember that these are averages over 90 members each. That's the ensemble mean. And the shading tells us if the ensemble mean average sits outside the shading, we can say that we have a robust signal. If it doesn't, we don't have a signal. And the only instance really where you get a strong and robust signal is if you reduce emissions by 100%, just completely turned off all the emissions, in which case you do see in the beginning warming, okay? Much like in the Forster et al. Case, but even larger magnitude, now up to about 1/10 of a degree Celsius. But there's a hint, carrying forward in the later part of the record of cooling associated with greenhouse gases, but these ups and downs are still sitting within the gray shading, so we can't make a very strong attribution statement. The next thing we did is, this is a calculation where we changed all of the emissions in the model at the same time. We also did calculations, again, 90 members each, where we just changed CO2 and we just changed the aerosols in order to separate their effects, much like in the Forster et al. Paper. And here are the 2 sets of experiments. So on the left, you see the aerosol-driven experiments, and the right, the CO2-driven experiments. And this tells us that it is the case that what we saw in the total, where we saw warming initially, is really driven by the aerosols. Okay, that's that blue curve on the left, jumping up, way above the uncertainty range. And we can see that the cooling that we see, out to 2030 is really CO2 driven. Okay, so that blue curve, for example, lies below the uncertainty range. So we have 2 things going on here that make it difficult to detect signals. We have a large component of internal variability, and we have aerosols and CO2 competing with one another. So you're really looking at, in the signal, a balance between 2 large numbers, which makes it doubly difficult to make a claim of detection. All right, so that's that. As I mentioned, the other thing that we can do beyond Forster et al. And what I just showed you now is we can look at the patterns of change and see, it might be the case we can't see anything in the global average, but we might see something regionally. So it's a valid question to then look regionally. Maybe there will be signals that pop up locally that are significant. And what you're looking at here are maps of change. So these are anomalies averaged from January 2020 to December 22. So that's the first 36 months of our simulations. We have precipitation on the left, sorry, we have temperature on the left and precipitation on the right. In the case where we reduced emissions by 100%, highly unrealistic in the current context, but we really wanted to drive the system to see where we get. So we look at the temperature plot. The stippling indicates where the signal is statistically significant. The ensemble mean signal is statistically significant. The red shades indicate warming. And this is the case, there's warming almost everywhere, especially in the Northern Hemisphere where the emission sources are, which is not a surprise. In fact, you can almost pick out the emission sources. If you look at North America, Eastern North America, there's a red blob, and in Asia, a red blob. So that makes physical sense to us. In terms of precipitation, there is generally an increase in precipitation. This is a well-known consequence of rising temperatures, increased precipitation generally, but there's quite a bit of regional structure here. These precipitation changes are largest in the tropics, and they're represented by increased precipitation north. So these are these, what color is that? Magenta. Or cyan. The precipitation increases are primarily in the north of the equator, and the decreases are south of the equator. And that's indicative of a shift of the intertropical convergence zone. So this does seem to be a robust signal of short-term emission reductions over the first few years. And again, we can break this down into these experiments where we just drive aerosols and where we just drive CO2. And so this is the aerosol component. And the aerosol component really explains what we saw in the previous figure. If I just kind of toggle back and forth, you can see it's really the aerosols that are driving the near-term response in the climate system. Again, warming, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere around the source regions, and a shift of the intertropical convergence zone associated with aerosols. And in terms of CO2, not a big surprise here either. On the left, we see primarily blue shades. That represents cooling, although it's not really statistically significant. You can see some stippling here and there, maybe a little bit more than you would expect by chance, but it's not a very strong signal. And then there's really nothing going on in terms of precipitation on the short term. The CO2s kick in later in time. So I'm kind of rounding the corner and getting to the end of the presentation. I just wanted to show you some more results from these experiments. I'll just go back one. Okay, so these are maps. These are point-wise calculations. The smaller scale you get to, the more noise there is, and it becomes more difficult to actually detect a signal. And so you like to do some averaging. And so I'm going to show plots now. They're so-called zonal averages. These are where you average along a latitude circle, each and every latitude circle. That provides some averaging, and maybe you'll see a signal in that way. And here we have on the left, these are all zonal averages. On the left, we have surface air temperature. From the top to the bottom, you're looking at these different experiments. All emissions reduced, aerosol emission reduced, and CO2 emissions reduced. And now we're looking at the gray shading again is the 90% confidence interval. And we're looking at these different cases, the 25% case, which is observationally relevant, the 50% and 100% case. And let's just look at the 25% case, which is closer to observed emission reductions. You can see in the total, this is the very top left panel, you can see that there actually is a significant warming in the mid latitudes in this case at 25% reduction. We didn't see that in the global mean because there's compensating effects, but there are regionally, we can identify a significant signal of warming in the mid latitudes. And it's driven, if you go down, one plot below, it's driven by the aerosols. So that red curve really jumps out of the the gray shading around 45 degrees north. And there's nothing in the CO2 case. And now looking to the right at precipitation, the very interesting feature here is in most of the curves that you're looking at, you see this kind of dipole structure with north of the equator, you see increasing precipitation, and south of the equator, you see decreasing precipitation. And that's what's reflective of a northward shift of the intertropical convergence zone. And that's something that is kind of marginally seen or detectable or robust in the 25% case. That is the observationally relevant case. And so there's some indication here that looking regionally, there's a hint of signals that, you know, in this system subject to short-term emission reductions. Okay, I have one more slide, well, two, one science and one just wrapping up with a couple, there's very big, broad brush conclusions. I want to bring to your attention a new sort of international model into comparison project that has been initiated because of COVID, and it's in support of the IPCC sixth assessment report. In the sixth assessment report, it's being understood, and it's now the case that we need to address COVID in the report. And myself and a German colleague are coordinating a large discussion of COVID in the report that will be coming out next year. And this is a project that where modeling groups around the world are doing standard experiments. It doesn't have a name yet. It originally was the COVID MIP, and now we're calling it the Blip MIP. And all these modeling groups are using a standardized forcing protocol. Again, the baseline is this 2-4.5 scenario for the future. The Blip experiments are based on the Forster et al. Data that I showed you earlier and went through with you. You know, those emissions that they introduced into a very simple model are now introduced into these comprehensive Earth system models, not just one, but many. Okay. The results I'm showing you here are from our model, CAN-ESM5. Not all the modeling groups have finished their calculations yet, and so not everything is in. And these calculations are based on 30 simulations each. And we're showing CO2 concentration, SO2 burden, global temperature, and Arctic sea ice. And if you look at the CO2 concentration plot, in these simulations, CO2, well, we have emissions, but then offline, the concentrations were produced by the Forster et al. Group. And it's the concentrations that are imposed. And so there's no internal variability, but you can see the baseline, you know, CO2 is increasing. And in the 2-year Blip experiment, there's been a slight decrease, and then CO2 concentrations, you know, also increase, but at a lower level. The really interesting feature in these experiments is what you see on the top right. This is the SO2 burden, and you can see. And I also have to say that the shading here now isn't the shading on the ensemble mean, rather it's the 5 to 95% range across the simulation. So, you know, 90% of the simulations have values that are within that range, the ranges that I've indicated here. And this tells us immediately that there's a very strong possibility of detecting in observations a signal of a decrease in SO2 burden in the atmosphere in observations. And people now are looking at this and looking for this reduction in SO2 burden, and so that would be an advance. But then there's a recovery and nothing after the first few years. In global temperature and Arctic sea ice, there's just nothing to be said. Viewed from the point of view of these 5 to 95% ranges, there just isn't a signal that is detectable in global temperature. We thought possibly we might see something in Arctic sea ice, because there are many papers now that have indicated kind of a strong aerosol impact in the Arctic that reflects in Arctic sea ice changes, but there's nothing there at all. All right, so that's all the science bits. I have a couple of key takeaway messages. The first one is that short-term emission reductions, even large, you know, as large as they can get, have only a small and likely undetectable impact on climate overall. And it's important to bear in mind that if we really want to, you know, reduce temperatures and ultimately stabilize temperature, to accomplish that, we need to, you know, have, you know, year upon year emission reductions to net zero. It's never going to be these little blips that'll get us there. They're just going to be a bit of a distraction in terms of, you know, solving the situation that we're in. We have to be doing this, and we have to be doing it, starting to do it very soon. Okay, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank
Happy
you,
to
John.
take questions.
Yeah, thank you, John, for these nice and informative presentations. I think we learned something from this reduction, this abrupt reduction and its impacts on our climate system. Yeah. So we can start with a couple of questions. So I saw Shang Chen. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yeah. So hello, I have a questions. What are the factors of AER driven standing for? I guess it referred to the aerosol.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, what's the question?
What are the factors of AER driven standing for?
Well, sorry, I should have spelled out that acronym for you. Yeah, this refers to aerosols. So these are all the aerosols that we treat in our model. So sulfate aerosols, there's inorganic carbon, black carbon, brown carbon. It's all of the aerosol particulates that we treat in our model prognostically. So we have these quantities change and evolve in time. I'm not sure if that is answering the question. There are many factors that drive changes in these aerosols, and it depends on the particular aerosol, the aerosol size, the distribution of the aerosols, where the aerosols reside. There are many factors that contribute to how these aerosols develop in the climate system.
So basically you change all the components of aerosol forcing.
The emissions,
yeah,
and then the aerosols, yeah, the emissions of the aerosols are prescribed. So we, tell the system, how are emissions changing at their source regions, typically in Asia, Europe, United States. And then the model itself, transports those aerosols around and has the aerosols interact with the climate system, clouds, the land surface, and so on and so forth, in a way that tries to mimic how they behave in the real world.
So the aerosol forcing still has the spatial heterogeneity, right? Spatial difference.
Well, the emissions that are prescribed are spatially inhomogeneous. The emission, the aerosols come from the source regions that are localized.
Right.
Then those emissions get transported around, those quantities get transported around the planet. In the case of aerosols, they get transported quite a long distance away from their source regions, but not as far as greenhouse gases, because the greenhouse gases are much more long-lived and they distribute across the whole planet over time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we do have the other questions from Helena Martins. So the first one is, you didn't present the word map for the 25% emission reduction experiment, the closest to reality. Were the differences obtained significant? And did you have a look at the result after 2030?
Yes, I haven't myself looked at the map for the 25% reduction, only because we anticipated that we're not going to see anything that's significant. That is, we'll see some colors, but we're going to see very few dots. That's our expectation there. That's my expectation there. And then going out further in time, it's the same story. There really isn't a significant signal at 25%.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Halina has the other questions. What can you say about this competing role between aerosols and greenhouse gas in meeting the Paris Agreement?
Well, it is, so yeah, so that's a little bit off topic of COVID, but I mentioned this scenario, SSP 2-4.5. So it's a scenario that's being developed by integrated assessment folks, people who understand how economies work and how economies adapt to change and so on. And each scenario has a different storyline behind it. And these storylines reflect what society is going to be doing with aerosols, with greenhouse gases, and other chemical constituents of the atmosphere. And what they do varies from scenario to scenario. Some emission reductions, some pathways have, very aggressive aerosol emission reduction plans. Others have less. Some have, strong greenhouse gas emission plans and less. So it's a combination of effects across all of these scenarios. You have to look at the particular scenario and then do an assessment of that particular scenario on future climate. I don't know if that helps, but I'm not sure if that's answering the question or not, but that's what I have to say.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it's an interesting research topics, right? So I saw many papers discussing this competing role between aerosol and the greenhouse gases in the past or in the future.
Oh, of course.
Different scenario, yeah. And
no, I think aerosols are key. They're the largest uncertainty that we have. And they're key to understanding what's happened in the past and key to what we're going to do in the future. It is the case that, aerosol reductions, the conundrum is that reducing aerosols is actually a warming impact. And that's already been demonstrated in observations. There was a Clean Air Act that was enacted where aerosol emissions have been on the decline. And that's actually a warming impact. So we're working against ourselves by reducing aerosols, as you know. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We have the other questions from Jason Gabriel Pinza. So the precipitation changes are driven mostly by aerosol.
Yeah.
Can this be explained by the role of aerosols as nuclei or precipitation, or is it more the fact that aerosol affects solar radiations?
Yeah, we haven't diagnosed. That's a very good question. We haven't diagnosed, the physics that are involved. I mean, it's presumably I can't answer that question, but it's in the solar part of the spectrum, I'm sure, where the response is developing. And it's a dynamical response. In fact, we have a paper out just a few months ago in Nature Climate Change by Bonfils, if you're interested, Bonfils, where we've, in observations, detected, this is a detection and attribution study, detected a shift in the intertropical convergence zone and have attributed it to aerosols and have a more complete description of the physics that are involved. We haven't looked at that particular issue in these simulations.
So, okay. So seems I didn't see any more questions on chat. Oh, there's one. So, so Jason asked, and any comments on this effect on Enso cycles?
I would be very surprised if we saw an Enso response. We haven't thought of that. I mean, it is true that these aerosol experiments, like when you reduce aerosol in the way we have, it's a bit like a volcanic eruption in the opposite sense. And there has been quite a bit of work indicating that strong volcanic eruptions do have an impact on Enso. The response is very Enso-like, but they can actually, I mean, it's not conclusive, but they can actually influence, the amplitude, and frequency of Enso events. And so it's, it may be the case that we would see something in these, especially these dramatic Enso or aerosol reduction cases, a Enso-like response. So that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought to look at that. Although although these studies that deal with the relationship between aerosol forcing and Enso typically are tropical volcanoes, and what we're talking about, the source regions here are quite a bit further, like way in the northern hemisphere. It might be a bit hard to imagine that there's going to be a connection between aerosol reduction in high northern latitude and the tropical Enso.
So in your surface temperature anomaly plots, for example, do you see
Yeah.
some like temperature change in tropical Pacific, or the temperature gradient may change a little bit, something like that?
Look right here.
Yeah.
Well, this is it here.
Yeah.
So looking at the tropical, yeah, there's something in the tropical Pacific. It's I wouldn't call it Enso-like.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's the plot to look at. So the one on the left. I mean, maybe there's a little signal, but
yeah, maybe not very not very strong and the typical Enso forcing and Enso warming patterns. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good question. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have a follow-up questions from Xiang Chen. So very interesting result. So what prediction model did you use in this research? I think.
Well, the figure you're looking at now, for example, this is based on the Canadian Earth System model, version 5. This is our latest Earth System model, an emissions-driven model. And as I mentioned before, this is the model we've used for CMIP 6. This is a coupled model intercomparison project that all the modeling groups in the world have participated in and have uploaded data to a data server. It's called the ESGF. And so the data that we have on there for our model is from this model.
Okay, thanks. So do you have any more questions? Feel free to type in the chat box. So John, I do have questions. So if you look at the zonal mean plot, I think next two, yeah, this one. So if we just look at the left panels, ACE, and if we focus on 50% reduction runs, so it seems like the effect of aerosol and the carbon dioxide is not linear additive, right? So right, if we look at the brown curve in A, it's not the brown curve in C and D. Some of C and D, right? So this kind of tells us there's some nonlinear or indirect interaction between two forcings on the climate system, right?
Yeah, so you're talking about the additivity, that is,
right.
Did the bottom two panels add up to the top panel? Is that the question?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, no, no, they don't look strongly. No, they don't look strongly additive, that's for sure. But then again, the signals are weak. When you're assessing additivity, that's an extra stringent statistical test, because the uncertainty then you need to add. So we have the uncertainties that you see here, say in panel C and D, you need to add in quadrature. You don't only add the ensemble mean curves, you have to add the uncertainty in quadrature. So the uncertainty gets larger and it becomes more and more difficult to assess whether or not additivity exists. There's a lot of sampling uncertainty because you're doing an arithmetic operation here and uncertainty accumulates. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, but if you compare to 100% reduction, so it seems more additive. I mean, at least for the first order approximation. Yeah. So
yeah. No, you're right.
No, I hadn't thought. Surprised. Like it's different from 100% and 50%. Yeah.
No, I hadn't spotted that. That's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah, it just wasn't the focus of this study, but yeah, that's well noted. Thank you.
Sure. So one more question from Jason. So what could your models say about hydrological cycles? Are they becomes more accelerated?
We've only looked at precipitation. I mean, there's opportunity to look at the hydrological cycle. And I will say, as part of this Blip MIP that I mentioned, there's the opportunity for anybody to download, once we get the data available, to download it and analyze it in any way they would like to, as a sort of international project. And I think people are already devising different analyses that they would like to look at, including hydrology, but in a multi-model context. I mean, we haven't looked at the hydrological cycle apart from just looking at precipitation, but those kinds of things will be analyzed in due course in this multimodal ensemble. I mean, it's good to it's worthwhile bearing in mind that the signals, I'm not super optimistic because the signals are very small and for the most part, not detectable. And so I personally wouldn't be spending the rest of my career trying to analyze and understand these small and indetectable signals, but there could be surprises.
Okay, so if we, we have one more question. So what policy suggestions could you get from your result? Would you have an example?
I think, well, so there's another dimension to this that I didn't talk about. In the Forster et al. Paper, they looked at these they considered these blip experiments, and in our results, we've only been looking at the blips. But in parallel, there are other simulations that are more speculative in terms of the emissions that we think might happen in the future. So we have emission scenarios that are green driven, where we try to learn from what we've done in the past and try to recover in a green way. So we have experiments like that. And we have other ones where we kind of ignore past lessons and we just continue business as usual, or maybe even ramp up emissions, as has been seen in previous sort of economic disruptions and recessions. And so we have a range of simulations. They're described in the Forster et al. Paper, and that aspect of the paper is more policy driven, not telling society what to do, but telling them what the consequences are of their choices. And similarly in this Blip MIP, it's broader than that as well. It also looks at these Forster et al. Experiments, and they run out to 2050. And they ask, how is this all going to play out in terms of our long-term ambitions to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius? So I haven't commented about that, and I wouldn't have time to get into it now, but I'd encourage you to look at the Forster et al. Paper, which is very clearly and well written to answer that question.
Okay, thanks, John, and thanks all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
So I think we can wrap up here. So, okay, so we have the recording, so everything will upload on our YES website. So if you want to check this presentation, you can look at it after. And yeah, thanks, John, again. And before we leave, we have a quick advertisement for our next webinar. So next webinar will be presented by Dr. Roxy Cole, and it will be talking about the climate change in the Indian Ocean and its impacts. It's on November 5, 1 p.m. UTC. So if you have interest, please register. Okay, so thank you everyone again, and see you next time. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.